Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Thank you for the excellent work of this commission. Congressman Gallagher, can I start with you? I want to come back to something that you mentioned in your joint testimony, which is how China has used cyber-enabled economic warfare to fuel its rise, including the theft of trillions of dollars worth of intellectual property and attempts to undercut our economic competitiveness, which I particularly appreciated your focus on this and have appreciated your own work in the House on this issue. So I just want to give you a chance to expand on some of those themes, which I think are so important. So let me just start by asking, when it comes to cyber attacks, what is it you see? How does China typically operate? How do they typically attack? Whom do they typically target? And what is it that they seek to gain or disrupt?
Well, just quickly, my own awakening on this issue was painful. I spent most of the last decade as a Middle East specialist in uniform, not really understanding much about the way in which China operated. But I remember vividly getting a letter from the Office of Personnel Management after the massive hack of over 22 million people's, federal government employees' records, saying, thank you for your service, but your records have been hacked. And that was really a wake-up call for me to recognize that I needed to widen my own aperture and understand what was going on. And of course, General Secretary Xi Jinping had just come to power 2 years prior. And I think it's fair to say that even the most hawkish sinologist at that time didn't yet fully understand how aggressive a direction he would take the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, since that point, we've not only had the OPM hack, we've had multiple a series of attacks that we know go all the way back directly to the Chinese Communist Party. In addition, we know that there are certain state champions, Huawei and ZTE in particular, that operate effectively as appendages of the Chinese Communist Party. We had the in-depth reporting from the Wall Street Journal suggesting that Huawei technology at the African Union headquarters essentially beam-backed information every night at the same time around midnight. We've had something called the Finite States Report, which pointed out the scale in which Huawei technology has been compromised. And so we found nothing to contradict that assessment in our own work on the commission. If anything, we would emphasize the findings of the Blair-Huntsman Commission, which called the transfer of the intellectual property theft on the order of $300 billion a year, the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. I would say that up to this point, and what I alluded to in my opening testimony, we've taken primarily a defensive approach, which has been necessary but insufficient. In other words, we've said, we're going to put Huawei on the entities list. We're going to do a variety of things to dissuade our allies from operating with certain CCP champions. However, what the commission recommends is adding to that with a positive approach that involves a significant investment in research and development, finding creative ways to work with allied countries on key technologies in order to ensure that we aren't dangerously dependent on China going forward, and finding a way just to make a positive case for American global leadership as in a contrasting case with what we've seen from the CCP.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for that. Let me ask you just a little bit about a closely related topic, which is our supply chain vulnerability, and particularly as it relates to China. I was pleased to see the report acknowledge how extended supply chains threaten the U.S. ecosystem, our economic ecosystem. And of course, I've been an advocate myself for reshoring, onshoring supply chains, particularly our critical supply chains, whenever and wherever possible. Can you elaborate for us on some of the Commission's recommendations for addressing supply chain vulnerabilities through risk management techniques, and what role in particular do you see the private sector playing here?
Absolutely. So we recommend in, I believe, recommendation 4.6 in our report that Congress directs the government to develop and implement an information and communications technology industrial-based strategy to ensure more trusted supply chains and the availability of critical information and communications technology. So this starts with a simple identification of which technologies are critical and where we have single points of failure in the supply chain, so that we're not discovering those single points of failure in the midst of a crisis, which I would submit we are in some cases when it comes to advanced pharmaceutical indicators, certain basic medical equipment right now. And so we're asking the federal government with an enhanced CISA and an enhanced cyber focus more generally to identify proactively where are the areas where, no kidding, we either have to bring that manufacturing back to the United States, as you've had multiple pieces of legislation aimed at doing that, but potentially also work with partners. So, for example, when it comes to semiconductors, Taiwan is an obvious target for enhanced cooperation. And I believe the administration right now is exploring some sort of deal with TSCM, a major Taiwanese semiconductor company, in order to build certain facilities in the United States. But it all starts with that identification of our domestic and our allied ICT industrial capacity and identifying those key areas of risk where a foreign adversary could potentially restrict the supply of a critical technology or intentionally introduce supply chain compromise at a large scale. And that in turn should direct our actual investments in those key areas and our investments in research and development.
Yeah, that's really good. Tell me about what role you think the private sector plays here and how we get a balance of both requirements and also incentives to help the private sector get to where it needs to be.
I think this is one of the major things we wrestled with throughout the commission's entire work, which is to say, how do you get that balance between, we don't want to sort of out CCP, the CCP, for lack of a better term. We can't adopt a one-size-fits-all, heavy-handed, top-down series of regulations, and Tom Fanning can attest to that better than anyone else, given his unique position. How do we instead pursue that incentivizing approach? And what we sort of landed on is there are simple things we can do to incentivize the private sector rather than mandate they do certain things. So, for example, one of the recommendations you see in the report is mandatory penetration testing for publicly traded companies so that they have to invest more in cybersecurity. Because what we saw time and again is that wherever the C-suite did actually prioritize and take cybersecurity seriously, those companies outperformed their competitors. And so we would like to, for example, over time, see certain best practices that are emerging right now become the industry standard. So, for example, there's something called the 11060 rule, where you're able to detect an intrusion on your network in 1 minute. You're able to have someone look at it within 10 minutes, and then you're able to isolate it, quarantine it within 60 minutes. By incentivizing the C-suite to invest in cybersecurity, we believe that over time, though, best practices like that can become the norm. And I would say, and Suzanne alluded to this before, we deliberately try to adopt an approach that harnessed market forces so that the private sector could step up and respond to a clear incentive that the federal government is setting.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thank you all.
Senator Hawley, I'd like to touch on your question for a moment.
Yes,
the supply chain. Number one, we've learned within the COVID situation how critical the supply chain is and what a mistake it is to rely on supplies for critical materials outside of our borders. The second piece is we have to realize that the Chinese are integrating economic policy with intelligence and national policy by subsidizing things like Huawei to make it cheaper in order to insinuate itself into the nation's or the world's internet infrastructure. We have to realize the cheapest may not be always the answer, and maybe a little premium on the price to have control of the supply chain is an insurance policy. And I think that's the way we have to look at this, because historically we've just said, well, we'll get the cheapest wherever we can, and that's going to bite us. And supply chain, I think we just have to analyze every piece of military equipment, every piece of critical infrastructure, and say, where is it coming from? And is it safe? Because I think you've identified one of the most serious issues that is facing us, and it's not going to quit.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Senator King, and thank you for your leadership over many years on this issue. And it's a privilege to get to serve with you on the committees that we do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.